Here's why I'm excited to be here tonight. My mother is here, so everybody can say hi to Verna. My 84-year-old mother drove out from Los Angeles. When I was a little girl, probably 7, 8, 9 years old, one of my most vivid memories about growing up in my house in Whittier, California, was waking up in the morning and getting ready for school. And while I was getting ready for school, both of my parents in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s were getting ready to go to work. And it just felt like a party. My dad slapped on his cologne and straightened his tie. My mom was in a pretty dress, and there was an air of excitement around the breakfast table. And it wasn't about the peanut butter or the eggs. It was about work. When I was 14 years old, I worked for a couple of weeks at my dad's company, punching little holes in those old IBM files. I'm really dating myself here. And at the end of 2 weeks, a woman from the company came to my desk and handed me an envelope with a little cellophane opening in it. I had no idea what it was. I didn't know if it was a note asking me to leave, so I took it. And being a 14-year-old girl and not wanting to be embarrassed, I went to the bathroom and locked myself in the stall and opened it up. And it was a check with my name on it, typed out. Not a $5 bill wadded up from Mrs. Smith for babysitting her snotty-nosed kids, but a corporate check with money attached to it. And I was smitten with work. I'm also glad to be here in Palm Springs because when I was a girl of about 9 or 10 years old, my grandmother ran a little tiny motel down here called the Capri Motel with her mother, my great-grandmother. And my mother would throw me on the bus in July and send me down here to work with my grandmother. That wasn't work. That was actually against child labor laws. But nevertheless, work is the creation of good and the shaping of value in the world. And Dallas Willard said that work, as a Christ follower, is your primary place of discipleship. And there are huge implications in that. The work that you do as a CEO shapes our culture. From the way you treat your employees, to the way you make decisions, to the products and the services that you offer, all of you together are shaping the culture. And if it's any consolation, one of the best descriptions of leadership I have heard recently is it always feels like you are knee-deep in a somewhat unmanageable mess. So I'd like to take the next 28 minutes and 6 seconds to go over, because I hate speakers that go over time. I'm constantly telling my husband, you could have ended that sermon 5 minutes early. What part of leaving them wanting more do you not understand? I'd like to go with you through 4 points that I would use to answer the question, if I had been Jesus's leadership consultant. Because there are 4 major mistakes the man made. And had I been his leadership consultant, I would have pulled him off to the side and gone over each one of them individually. There's a lot we can learn from other people's mistakes. The first one is, one of the things that leaders have to understand is that timing is everything. Timing is everything. And if I was Jesus's leadership coach, I would sit him down and say, dude, if you have 33 and a half years, you don't wait till the last 3.5 years. You missed your window of opportunity. You failed to maximize your potential. You started off in obscurity when by the age of 30, you should have been poised and plotting your entrance. You kind of blew it. And I don't know if you're like me, but I know I am, that often worrying about timing and did I get everything right and did I maximize my potential? While sometimes it can be a challenge and a stretch, sometimes it can be a great burden. And it can stir up anxiety in a leader that wonders, am I managing everything right? Does everything actually depend on me? So Bob mentioned that about 9 months ago, I started in this new position as CEO of a citywide movement in the Bay Area. And I find myself thinking often that God is whispering to me, do you really believe that I'm at work when you're not? To which I say, no, I don't. And I think that's my job, is to get better at understanding that. Because see, timing isn't everything. Everything is everything, not timing. And you're never too young, and you're never too old, and you're not the wrong gender, and your education level isn't the only thing that matters. John and I sat down at dinner 2 nights ago with an elderly gentleman in our church and his wife, and this is a guy whose resume would blow your mind. He's been incredibly and extraordinarily successful in real estate development up in the Bay Area over the last 40 years. He is in his late 80s right now, and his health is failing rapidly. They had told him before Christmas that he might not make it through Christmas, and here it is, April. And we were sitting down having dinner with him as he was talking about some of the ways he would like to financially contribute to the church after his death. It was a very profound dinner. But what I noticed more than anything, and I've known this man for a number of years, is there is a fresh and new expression of God's Spirit in his life, even at this point. Because he's realizing that there are still new things to learn about God. And this man who built his entire business on being in control every minute said at dinner 2 nights ago, I realize I've never really been in control. And when he said it, part of me felt sad that he wasn't able to say it 40 years ago, and immediately I felt glad that he was able to say it now. And timing doesn't need to be this burden over you all the time. The second thing I would have coached Jesus on is his understanding and use of language. Because Jesus, if you're going to start a movement, if you're going to create momentum, you want to talk about big things. You want to talk about lightning and tsunamis and seismic shifts. You want to talk about innovation and tipping point. You don't want to talk about yeast and salt and light and seeds. You don't want to talk about birds and flowers. Seriously, you lost every man in the audience. Fishes and loaves and widow's mites, those stories are for children. They're for the flannel graph. They're for people that run tiny little businesses. They're not for leaders. Leaders want to take the hill. You need to match your language with what it is you are trying to create. And if you can understand my spiritual gift of sarcasm here, Jesus was introducing us to the mathematics of the kingdom of God. There's a fascinating passage in the Old Testament in Zechariah. And the context of this passage is that the Israelites have been in Babylonian captivity for over 60 years. They have been pulled out of the promised land, whisked away. And as generation after generation grew older and lived in Babylonian captivity, the older people were telling the younger people, someday, when we go back home, when we go to the promised land, I want to show you the temple. And they would talk in amazing language about the way the temple had been, because the temple wasn't just the source of all religious life in Israel. It was the source of all national life. It was the source of education and economics and commerce and business and religion. And so after 60 plus years in Babylonian captivity, when the next leader of Persia came in and overtook the Babylonians and released the Israelites to go back, they went back in clumps, in clusters, in little cohorts. And one of the first places they went was where the temple had been. And in Zechariah chapter 4, it says that there was a group of them that gathered around all that was left of the temple. And you can imagine the older people who had been telling the stories in Babylon about the grandeur of the temple with the younger people who had imagined it in their minds, and all of them stood around the reality of the collapse and the rubble and simply the lines of the foundation that were in the ground. And while they were looking at it, actually in Haggai, the book before, God speaks to his people. And here again is the importance of understanding language as a leader. I would think after 60 years in Babylonian captivity and all the dreams of the temple and then them coming back and being so discouraged at what was left, that this would be a really good time for God to use a little bit of encouragement, right? Here's what he says to the people. Who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? I think I would have washed my kid's mouth out with soap for that one. It feels like the knife is going in and he's twisting it just a little bit. They're already discouraged. They already can't see the vision of the rebuilding of the temple. They don't have much hope left, and yet God shows up with kind of harsh words. And then he says three things. Three things that are the trifecta of vision. Three things that will show his people that he is still with them in this. And they are good words for leaders to think of. The first thing he says, now be strong. Find your courage, because you're going to need your courage more than you need any encouragement from me. And then he says another word. Alongside of finding your courage, work. Because work is a glorious word. Use the gifts and the ability and the mind and the ingenuity and the physical abilities that I've given you and work. Find your courage and work. And then the last thing he says, for I am with you. That's all you need. Your courage, your work, and the presence of God. And then over in Zechariah, as they're standing around the rubble, he says, I have anointed a man named Zerubbabel who will lead the process of rebuilding the temple. And then he says a very odd thing. When Zerubbabel comes with a plumb line in his hand, rejoice. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever done remodeling jobs in your home, in your office. There are lots of points of enthusiasm when you draw out the sketch with the architect, when you pick the paint for the walls. But the plumb line does not strike me as a particularly exciting moment in the building of anything. And then God goes on to say why. He says, do not despise the day of small things. Because once again, God is trying to teach his people that it is in the small things that vision happens. The vision is the easy part. It's the ministry of monotony every single day to execute against that vision where leadership is birthed. And so Jesus knew exactly what he was talking about when he talked about the disproportionate impact of small things. Of yeast, when it infuses flour in the bread. A little bit of salt to change the taste and the flavor of something, for a little shaft of light to bring hope in darkness. For something as small as a seed that lies dormant for so long that can spring forth and bring great light. And our leadership needs an infusion of this kind of language to remember the small things. I have a good friend who recently, after a very long period of time away from God, came back to faith just a couple of years ago. And one of the things that I brought her to her home was a little glass bowl full of mustard seeds. And I said, every morning when you get ready to leave for work, just grab one of those and slip them under your fingernail. It won't last for very long, but pull it out every once in a while and rub it between your thumb and your forefinger. Jesus set the bar very low. This is all the faith you need. That's it. It's a disproportionate impact of small things. many, many years ago when Greg and Shelley and I were at Biola. And by the way, I'd like to tell you that the most fascinating conversation I've had in a long time happened at dinner tonight when I found out that Shelley broke up with Greg 7 times before they got engaged. 7. She will be doing a breakout session tomorrow on that whole story. I started Biola as a pre-med major. I loved it until I hit inorganic chemistry, and I thought, what the heck is this? Get me out of here. I switched to a nursing major, picked up a minor in speech communications, tried to change my major one more time, and my father, who was not a believer at the time, strung about 4 or 5 expletives together, took the Lord's name in vain and said no. So I was a nurse. And I remember the first year I worked after I graduated from Biola at St. Joseph's Hospital in Orange. I was a brand new nurse, and for all of us that have ever been new on a job, your prayer every day, at least for mine as a nurse, was, don't let me kill anybody today. Don't let me kill anybody today. Tomorrow's fine, but not today. I was terrified for the first 3 months. You're on probation. You have to follow another nurse around. At the end of my first 3 months of probation, which is on day shift where they can keep a very sharp eye on you, every new nurse goes either to swing shift, 3 to 11:30, or night shift, 11:30 to 7, and I was scheduled to go on swing shift. The problem was at the end of those 3 months of orientation were the 2 weeks of Christmas break. My boyfriend at the time, whose name was not John, so you know where that relationship went, it was a long-distance relationship, and he was coming back from school, and he was only going to be home for those 2 weeks. So I needed to get the courage to ask my director of nurses, as a brand new nurse, could I have 2 more weeks on day shift so that I could see my boyfriend? Sounds challenging, but not that hard, except when you realize that I worked at St. Joseph's Hospital, and the head of the nursing department was a nun. She was about 5'2". The neurosurgeons ran from her in terror. She would clomp her heels down, and she was just a force of nature. So for a week or 2, I practiced my speech. I bailed out a couple of times. The days were counting down to when Dan was going to get back, and I finally just pushed myself in front of her, and I said, Sister Judy, my name is Nancy. You don't know who I am, but. And then I started to go through my spiel that I had memorized about asking for 14 more days on day shift, and she stopped me. And she said, 5 words. I know who you are. Oh, it's been 35 years since she said that to me. I don't even remember finishing my spiel. She gave me the extra 2 weeks off. But I know who you are. And then she said, the reports from the nurse that you're shadowing are good. And my guess is if you keep on this track, within about a year, we'll be talking to you about a relief charge nurse position. Whoa. 35 years later. In that little tiny sentence, I know who you are. You talk about the disproportionate impact of small things. Somebody had been paying attention to me. Never underestimate that ability to change the trajectory of somebody's life. If you as a leader pay attention. The third thing, and I would say of all the things that I would have to sit Jesus down about and cluck my tongue at him, this would be the biggest, because I've been working for Pat Lencioni for the last 12 years. I'm a huge believer in team. The third thing, beyond timing and language, would be Jesus's choice of team. Not good. Really not good. You know, I hear all the time, life is too short to spend time with people that you don't enjoy. Jesus violated that significantly, ladies and gentlemen. Significantly. Get it right. Get your team right. Get the brightest and the best. Get chemistry around you. And one of the myths that you will hear often is that Jesus went off by himself and prayed. And magically, these 12 names popped up into his head. It's not what the Gospels say. In fact, 3 of the 4 Gospels actually intimate that Jesus started walking down the street saying, yeah, I'll take you. Sure, yeah, come on, I can do this with anybody. I can do this with anybody. Let's just review for a brief moment his team. Andrew was the first person to follow Jesus. Andrew was responsible for bringing his brother, Peter, out of his sheer excitement at what he had discovered to Jesus. And very quickly, the brother that he brought overshadowed Andrew. Peter's a whole story on his own, isn't he? A real mess. More examples of him messing up and Jesus getting frustrated with that disciple than any other. Then there was James and John, the brothers, who the Bible refers to as sons of thunder. Actually, the translation is sons of anger. In Luke chapter 9, verse 54, there's a passage where in the middle of a time where Jesus is ministering to people, they get furious and Jesus has to pull them aside. They were kind of a mess. John and Peter had a rivalry going on. They did not like each other. They fought each other a fair amount. They argued over who was the greatest. And in a stroke of leadership development brilliance, in Luke chapter 22, Jesus sent Peter and John together as a little team to get the Passover ready. Really ridiculous team. Thomas was not sure about this whole thing. Simon was a zealot. Let's stop for just a second here. Simon was of a political party, an Israeli nationalist who was committed to the overthrow of the Roman government. He was convinced that that was Jesus' goal as well. Can you imagine his anger when he realized that's not where this whole thing was going? Can you imagine his anger when he heard Jesus say to the Roman centurion, "I have never seen such a faith as one like you"? And right next to Simon the Zealot, Matthew plopped down the tax collector, and the two of them were like oil and water next to each other. Thaddeus in John chapter 14 didn't get what was going on, and he said to Jesus, "Why do you keep telling us who you are, but not the whole world?" And then there was Judas. This was not a dream team, ladies and gentlemen. This was a broken, dysfunctional team who went on to change the world because Jesus was their leader. Jesus not only sent Peter and John out to prepare the Passover, but on the backside of the resurrection and after Pentecost, it says in Acts chapter 3 that Peter and John went to the temple together to preach. In the next chapters, one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible, I know I'm going to get in trouble when I get to heaven for having favorite verses, but there you have it. It says that after Peter and John had preached together, that this was the reaction of the people. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, the Greek translation there is idiots, they were astonished and they took note because these men had been with Jesus. The common denominator here was a leader who saw what was possible in each of these men. And in the middle of great dysfunction and frustration, and the majority of Jesus' interactions with his disciples were difficult conversations and conflict, way more than prayer and encouragement, to spiritually form them. Something happened when this group of people came together and Jesus led them. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says in his book, Life Together, that a disillusionment with other people is the starting place of Christian community. Now, of course, there are times when you have to let somebody go. But sometimes when I hear Christians talk about this chemistry thing and how life's too short not to work with people you don't like a lot, I think, I don't know that that's the gospel. I don't know that that's community. Here's what I know as a leader. I have woken up some nights at 2:30 in the morning thinking of an employee, thinking, that's it, I'm done with them. I have to let them go. And then I go back to sleep and I wake up at 4 and I think, no, I can develop them. And it's that tension, that living between the two, where God lives most deeply with leaders. Jesus' team was a mess. And because it was such a mess, nobody took them very seriously. Certainly not the religious leaders or the political leaders. But Jesus was planting seeds, and Jesus was teaching, and Jesus was correcting. And then after the resurrection, the Holy Spirit came and breathed into these men something extraordinary. In Acts chapter 8, Peter and John went together to Samaria and started a movement the likes of which the world has never seen. Not with a dream team, but with a great leader. Greg asked a few minutes ago, how do you really love your people? Do they know that you know them? Do you give them feedback, both positive and negative, for their own good? Do you show perseverance with them? Do you congratulate them? Do you move them around in a place where they might flourish even more than they are? Because when I read the Gospels, I get a very different picture of what it means to create a team. And then the last thing that I would sit down with Jesus and qualify as a failure is his succession planning. Of all the disciples, you tell me you're going to pick Peter. Wow. You're looking for the cream of the crop, Jesus. You're not looking for the one who made the most mistakes. You're not looking for the one that put his foot in his mouth, not just once, but multiple times. You're not looking for the guy that cut the soldier's ear off. That's just not who you're looking for. There's a fascinating passage in John chapter 21 where even after the resurrection, I would have questioned Jesus' sanity when he turned the keys of the kingdom over to Peter, where he's walking with Peter along the beach. And he tells Peter, I want you to feed my sheep. And then he tells Peter how he will die. One day you will stretch out your hand and someone will lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus told him to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would die. And once again, Jesus said, follow me. And Peter said, it says that Peter turned around and looked at the disciple that was following him and said, what about him? What about him? And what's fascinating is you think the big sins of adultery and murder would get Jesus riled up, but this is the simple sin of comparison. And Jesus says in a very vitriolic tone, what is that to you? If I allow him to remain alive until I return, you follow me. Jesus was still correcting Peter's faux pas after he had put him at the top of his succession plan. There is hope for all of us. It was Jesus that made the disciples great. It even says in Matthew chapter 28 that after Jesus was resurrected that the disciples worshiped, but some of them still doubted. It's really good news, I think. That Jesus doesn't use you as a leader because you have it all together or that you are the brightest person in the room. He uses you as a leader because he gave you that gift, and he's given you an opportunity, and he's given you people and a product and a service and a chance to make a difference in the world. One of the best definitions of leadership I've ever come across in 30 years is this: leadership is about creating a way for people to contribute to make something extraordinary happen. It's about creating a way for people to contribute to make something extraordinary happen. And I remember the first time I heard that definition just about 3 years ago, I loved it. I loved it because of all of its possibilities and potential, but a second wave of my emotions loved it because that's exactly what Jesus did with the disciples. You have to remember that the majority of the disciples were fishermen, which meant they were rabbi school rejects. This was not the cream of the crop. And Jesus said, here's what Christian community is. And community is just the gospel word for the world's word of team. Here's what happens when people come together with Jesus at the center. Really remarkable things happen. There's a kind of radical inclusion and a generation of new ideas. There's a working together in ways that you care less about who gets credit and you get more excited about the idea. There's this kind of working together when you're a great leader where people pitch in when they don't have to and they work longer than they should because they want something extraordinary to happen. And I think leadership is one of the most amazing gifts that God has given every one of you in this room. And I think to use it well to create good in the world is one of your primary places of discipleship. And I have 48 seconds left, and I'm all done. So great.